Hey guys, so today we are going to talk about the exposure triangle. What is it and why does it matter? Now, I want to preface by saying I am not normally a technical teacher. I am a little self-conscious diving into this, but I also know that if you don't already know the exposure triangle and you want to do better and be a better photographer, then it's going to be a game changer if you learn this. So I'm going to teach you what I've learned from an experiential standpoint and how I have learned what my camera settings mean and how I can use those to make the photos that I want to make. Before I can teach you what the exposure triangle is, I think it's important that you understand what exposure means. Essentially, it's how light or how dark your photo is. The reason that matters is because a picture that's too dark isn't going to show the detail that you want, and a picture that's too light is going to blow everything out and make it too bright, also not showing your detail. And so you want to find that happy medium so that things look appropriate. Skin is not blown out, you can still see the detail in the skin. Perhaps it's the darkness of the shadows. It really just depends on what you want. But that is your goal basically every time you take a photo. Find how bright you want it to be. Now, understanding the exposure triangle is going to get you there. The exposure triangle includes three basic settings: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These settings work in harmony together to make a beautiful image, and I'm going to tell you what each of those settings means. So before we get into the settings, I want to be clear. Every setting comes at a cost. Whether you're going slower or faster, higher number or lower number, whatever it is, there is a pro and a con to what you're doing. And normally there is a benefit. There's a reason you might want to risk that con, but I'm going to go over kind of the pros and cons of each of those settings and then talk about how they all work in harmony together. So let's talk about those three basic settings, starting off with shutter speed. With shutter speed, the slower it is, the blurrier your photo might be, but also it means you're going to be able to let in more light. So if you are photographing something that is moving quickly, you want a faster shutter speed, because a faster shutter speed, while it might let in less light, is going to freeze your subject a lot better. The reason you might want to have a slower shutter speed is perhaps you have low light, you are using a tripod, so you're not going to be moving your camera, and maybe you're photographing something that's not moving, like landscape. But otherwise, you're going to need, for portraiture, a faster shutter speed so you can achieve the look that you want. If you're photographing something really fast, like sports or race cars, I don't know. If you're photographing race cars, then you're going to want a much faster shutter speed because that's going to be moving more quickly, and the faster the shutter speed, the better it will freeze your image. Now, let's talk about aperture. The lower your aperture is, the more light comes into your camera, meaning the brighter it will be, the better the bokeh will be, meaning the blurrier the background will be, and normally it's something that's very preferable for portraiture. Now, why would you not want that all the time? Well, if you're photographing something where you want the background to be more in focus, then you're going to want to raise your aperture to a higher number. It does come at a cost, meaning less light is going to be coming into your camera, so you'll have to adjust other settings in order to compensate for that. Now, why would you want more of your photo in focus? Let's say you're photographing landscape, or in my case, real estate or interior design. You're going to want as much detail in that photo as possible because we're not just focusing on someone's eyes or the interaction between two people, and we're not trying to make a dreamy artistic photo. We're trying to make something beautiful while still showing the detail of whatever it is we're photographing. So the third setting I want to talk about is ISO. The lower your ISO is, the less light you are going to be letting into your camera. The higher your ISO is, the more light you're going to be letting in. But ISO determines the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera. And so the more sensitivity that's dialed up on your camera, meaning the higher that ISO, the more grain you're going to have in your image, which is not a good look. Sometimes you can edit it out, but normally you're going to want to keep your ISO on the lower side to reduce the amount of grain in your photo. Now, combine them all and what do you get? You get the photo that you want, right? But figuring out what is preferable is kind of hard sometimes. So you might be someone who shoots with an iPhone normally, and you're like, why does this matter to me? My camera figures all of this out. Like, it's just as bright or just as dark as it needs to be. And that's true. When you shoot on auto mode, that is 100% true. And it's going to just determine the exposure for you. And as something like an iPhone has progressed and evolved, it has really cool settings so that you can do night photography, and it is guessing what modes you want to get the result that you're looking for. And so it can take care of a lot of that for you. But the reason you want to learn the exposure triangle is that when you are shooting in manual mode on a DSLR, it will allow you to absolutely control what you're getting so that you can get the exact photo that you want. Because sometimes when you're shooting in auto, a lot of times, you're kind of at the mercy of what it decides. Whereas in this case, you're educating yourself, you're equipping yourself so that you can be the decider and you can get what you want. Let's say, for example, you're photographing a tree and a bird flies across in the background. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, there's a bird, I need to increase my shutter speed, or the bird's gonna be blurry. Well, if you're on auto mode, you can't really control that. And then you have just a blurred out invisible bird in the background and a probably nice picture of a tree. On the flip side, let's say that you are shooting in a dark setting and your camera on auto mode decides to totally boost the ISO, giving you so much grain, and it just looks kind of not good in the end, especially when you go to look at it on your computer or you print it out. And that can lead to some disappointment, especially if it's something that you really loved. And if you know how to use your settings, if you know how to shoot in manual, then you can control that and hopefully prevent that from happening. Now, understanding the exposure triangle and knowing how to adjust your settings does not mean that you have to shoot in manual mode. It just means that you understand what those settings do. They have other shooting modes on a lot of cameras that allow you to prioritize one type of setting so that you can focus on that, and then the camera will guess with everything else. For example, a big favorite is aperture priority because people want those blurry backgrounds with their portraits. They want it to look yummy and delicious, have the bokeh with the circles, and you can't just tell your camera you want that unless you know how to adjust your aperture. So in aperture priority mode, you're going to set your aperture as low as you want it to go, provided you have a lens that lets you go nice and low to shoot wide open. And then the camera will guess on the other settings. Again, the risk you run with this is that the camera will way overdo it on the ISO and give you a super grainy photo, or it's not gonna know what shutter speed you need. And so it's gonna be blurry and you weren't wanting that. So it's not like a perfect system, but it does work if you're just trying to wrap your head around what everything is. For myself, when I go out to shoot portrait sessions, I have something I call my home-based settings. And I set those so that I know if I start here, I'm probably gonna get a decent photo, but I will adjust as needed. So normally, yes, I will determine my aperture first. Most of my lenses only shoot as wide as 2.8, so I will set my aperture to 2.8. I will typically set my shutter speed to 1/200 because I don't want it to go slower than that because I'm photographing moving subjects. Ideally, it would go higher than that. And then my ISO is probably gonna be around 400. I have to adjust all of these accordingly, and every time I'm taking photos, I count the risk. If I lower my shutter speed, am I in a situation where the person's not moving and I can hold really still so that there's no motion blur? If I have to boost my ISO, do I feel pretty confident that it's not so high that I can't edit out the grain in Photoshop, or is it going to be too far? So you're always kind of weighing the risks of what happens when you adjust your settings. And ultimately, it helps you know how to be a better artist and get what you want and help make your clients or just yourself happy. So hopefully this gave you a better idea of what the exposure triangle is. And I'm just excited for you to know it and to know what it means, what all these like crazy camera settings mean that seem like Greek. They're not that complicated, but it does take a while to get used to it. So be patient with yourself as you're learning it. It is not something that happens overnight, but it does become muscle memory after a while, I promise you. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, of course, leave them in the comments. I'm happy to help. And you know, there's a million other videos on exposure triangles too. So if mine did not communicate well for you, just find another one. I'm sure it will be very helpful. So it's just the reality of it. Okay, thanks for tuning in, guys.